I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say, especially if you are elderly. The visions I received after my period of fasting showed something that left me with a heavy heart. The elderly will suffer the most when everything begins between December 25th and 30th. I'm not saying this to scare anyone, I'm saying it because I saw it. I saw elderly people walking around lost, not understanding what was happening. I saw many being left behind because they couldn't keep up with the rush. I saw people desperate because they depended on medicine, banks, public services, and technology, exactly the things that will stop first. The elderly will be the first to feel the impact because they depend more on medical systems, retirement, transportation, medicines, digital accounts, electronic access, government services, and all of this will fail at once. That's why this message is so urgent. If you are elderly, listen carefully. If you have parents, grandparents, or older uncles, aunts, send this to them. What I share here is what was shown to me in prayer after days of seeking guidance. I wasn't expecting any of this, but the visions came as if someone opened my eyes to something that is about to happen, and when I saw what I saw, I understood that I can't keep it all to myself. I did a strict 7-day fast, and 3 days ago I woke up with a phrase that gave me chills. It was so vivid, it seemed like it had been spoken aloud. They won't be able to escape. It was about the elderly. At the time, I didn't understand. But after the visions, everything made sense. And today I need to tell you this. Before we continue, comment below where you're watching from. I'm noting down each state and city so I can pray for you before December ends. I had finished my fast that morning. It had been days of silent prayer without posting anything, without talking much to anyone, just trying to understand what God wanted to show me. When the fast ended, I was still weak, but something inside me seemed awakened. I sat in the living room to give thanks, as I always do, and it was at that moment that a different feeling came. It wasn't an immediate vision, it wasn't anything supernatural in the sense of a phenomenon. It was a firm, direct thought that came out of nowhere and made me stop what I was doing. The phrase came to me whole, without me trying to formulate it. Time is running out. I stood there staring into nothingness, like someone trying to understand a message that arrives without explanation. I knew God had spoken to me before, but this time it was different. I felt that it wasn't about me, it was about many people. I remained seated for a few minutes, breathing deeply, and began to feel as if my mind was being guided to pay attention to something important. It wasn't an open vision yet. It was more like when you remember something you never experienced, but it becomes clear. And then the images began to come. They came slowly, one after the other, as if someone were showing me a path. I saw the end of December, specifically between the days 25 and 30, as if that time window were highlighted. It was as if God were circling those dates and saying, "Prepare." This unsettled me because I don't usually receive things with a specific date. But this was so specific that it made me pay even closer attention because I knew it wasn't my imagination. The images began to become clearer, and this time I saw large cities. People walking normally, cars passing by, shops open as if nothing was wrong. But behind all of that, I perceived an emptiness, as if the world were on a countdown, and no one was noticing. And that's when the first impact came about. The elderly, I saw many of them trying to sort things out at the bank, fiddling with their cell phones, trying to pay bills online, trying to catch the bus, and nothing worked, nothing opened, nothing connected, nothing progressed. God showed me that the elderly would be the most affected when it all began, because they depend more on what will be affected. Credit cards, internet, medicine, transportation, medical care, apps, digital accounts. They would be the first to feel the shock. I was deeply moved watching this because it felt as real as remembering something that actually happened. I saw older people trying to contact family members and not being able to. I saw huge lines, confusion, people crying because they didn't know what to do. And I understood, without anyone needing to say it, that this was where God was showing me the need to warn people. It wasn't panic. It wasn't terror. It was responsibility. It was as if he were saying, they need to know, especially the elderly. And soon after that, the images changed to something completely different, the places of refuge. That's when I saw, for the first time, the communities in the mountains. Simple, peaceful places where people were already living away from the noise and complications of the cities. These communities lacked luxury, advanced technology, and modern infrastructure. They were simple houses, people who grew their own food, neighbors who knew each other well, water, a peaceful life. And God made me understand that these people would be protected because they already had a different routine. They weren't so dependent on the system that will collapse at the end of December. I saw elderly people living calmly in these places, without fear, because nothing changed there when the world collapsed. They continued eating, continued sleeping, continued living, as if they were in another time. When I saw this, I felt relief, because I realized that God had prepared real places, not imaginary ones. When the mountain view ended, I sat back down in my living room, still processing everything. I didn't cry, I didn't tremble, I didn't do anything dramatic. I just stayed quiet, absorbing the weight of it all. It was too much information, too much responsibility. And deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. I would still see the other refuges. I would still see the collapse. I would still see the persecution. But there, in that first moment, God made it clear that the warning needed to start with the elderly, because when December arrives, they will be the first to need help. After the mountain view faded, I thought it was all over. But no, it was as if the next part was waiting for me to calm down to continue. I was sitting in the same place, but my mind was pulled back, like when you remember something you didn't want to forget. The next image came softly but firmly, hidden caves and valleys. And again, it wasn't anything that seemed like fantasy. They were real places in the middle of rural areas and mountain ranges scattered throughout Brazil and other countries. Places that many people spend their entire lives living near and never realize exist. God showed me that these refugees weren't improvised now. They are places prepared long ago for this specific moment. I saw families being guided to these valleys as if they were following a very strong intuition, something that couldn't be explained logically. They weren't people looking for shelter. They were people obeying an inner direction. And when they arrived, they found enormous natural caves, with enough space for dozens of people, some even larger. What struck me most was that these places didn't look abandoned. There was clean water, space to rest, and a peace that I can't describe with technical words. It was as if God Himself had protected every detail for that time that is coming. And again, God made me look at the elderly. I saw many of them arriving in those valleys with difficulty, because the path there is not easy, but when they entered, it was as if their bodies rested. I saw older people sitting down slowly, breathing deeply, finally feeling safe. I understood once again that they would be the most affected by the collapse of the system. Medicines, transportation, medical appointments, technology, all of that will shut down at the end of December. That's why protecting them in these shelters will be so important. God has not forgotten them. Quite the contrary, He showed that the elderly are a priority. These caves had something different about them. It wasn't anything mystical. It wasn't a glow on the ceiling. It wasn't anything like that. It was simply the feeling that no one would be found there. God showed me that there will be persecution after the financial collapse, and that these places will be essential for entire families. And it wasn't persecution out there, far from Brazil. It was something that will happen all over the world, including here. People being forced to stop praying publicly, groups being treated as a threat just for gathering to read the Bible. But the valleys and caves wouldn't be detected. No satellite, no drone, no technological search would reach these places. I saw people living there without haste, without fear of what was happening outside. Some were cooking, others organizing the space, children were playing, the elderly were finally sleeping peacefully because chaos didn't enter inside. It was at that moment that I understood the purpose of that second refuge. God will use these valleys to protect families that He doesn't want to be destroyed by persecution. And this touched me deeply because I saw, very clearly, that it wasn't strong, rich, or influential people being led there. They were simple, humble people who had always had faith and little access to resources. When the vision ended, I felt within me the same urgency as in the previous chapter. It wasn't panic, it wasn't fear, it was responsibility. I knew I needed to talk about this, not to frighten anyone, but to prepare, because God didn't show refuge to cause despair. He showed refuge to give direction, and whoever hears this warning will have time to pray, reflect, and prepare practically. Especially the elderly, who will be the most vulnerable when the system collapses between the days. December 25th and 30th. When I came to, still quietly in my house, I only thought one thing. This is only the second one. There are still 2 more shelters I need to see. The next vision came gently, as if I were remembering something God wanted me to understand without confusion. I remained seated in the same corner of the house, still silent, when another image took shape within me. This time, those enormous buildings that everyone knows appeared: old warehouses, closed markets, shops that once bustled but have been forgotten over time. It was as if God were placing a circle around these places and saying, "Pay attention to this." And at that very moment, I understood that these spaces would be used as shelter when the chaos begins to tighten its grip at the end of December. These warehouses were abandoned on the outside, but inside there was activity. People arriving, setting tables, cleaning, sorting things, chatting calmly. It was as if families found a place of support there. And God made me realize that when churches are prevented from functioning normally, many Christians will be guided to these buildings. Nothing secret, nothing hidden by trickery, simply because these places no longer attract anyone's attention. They are unnoticed structures outside the areas where the government usually inspects and outside the common routine of cities. While watching the scene, something touched me in a special way. The elderly. They appeared, entering slowly, tired from the chaos that would be happening in the streets. Some arrived supported by family members, others walking alone, but all with that look of someone already exhausted. And as soon as they passed through the door, they were received with care: simple food, fresh water, a place to sit. God made it clear to me that this third refuge will exist primarily because of them, because in the collapse, without banks, without the system, without transportation, without medicine, the elderly will be the most affected, and he was showing them that he would not leave them without direction. There was something beautiful about the unity of that place. People helped each other without expecting anything in return. It was as if God were teaching that church doesn't depend on religious buildings, but on people who care for one another. I saw families arriving frightened and finding there an environment where they could breathe again. I saw young people volunteering to carry bags, arrange mattresses, and sort basic medicines. I saw elderly people being treated with respect, receiving attention they might not even have at home. And I realized that this simple environment would be essential for anyone who was lost and needed support when everything started to fall apart. In this third refuge, the provision wasn't theatrical. It was the fruit of organization, unity, and love for one's neighbor. Food stored in advance, filtered water, separate clothes, improvised mattresses, and above all, peace. I saw elderly people who had lost their pensions, had blocked accounts, and were behind on rent, rediscovering dignity in that place. No complicated technology, nothing requiring apps, passwords, or registration. Just humanity, just care, just the basics functioning. That's when I understood powerfully that God was raising up simple places to protect those whom the world usually ignores. When that part of the vision ended, I was quiet for a few seconds. I felt that responsibility that had been with me from the beginning. God wasn't showing tragedy to spread fear. He was giving direction. He was showing how people could get through this period without getting lost. And this third refuge made it clear that he doesn't need luxury or a gigantic structure to protect those who trust in him, especially the elderly, who don't keep up with this digital rush and end up vulnerable. I took a deep breath and realized that the last place was still missing. The fourth refuge. When the third vision faded, the next one came like an old memory someone suddenly unearths. It didn't come with shock or exaggerated emotion. It was just a clarity that took hold of me. This time, what appeared were small schools, the kind you find in the countryside. Very simple, with low walls and wooden windows. It was as if God were taking me to places where many people don't even pay attention. This fourth refuge wasn't grand at all. It was the kind of school where teachers know the students' parents by name, and where the children still play in the yard without fear. And I understood immediately that these places would be fundamental when the hardship begins between December 25th and 30th. These schools were located in rural areas or small towns, always far from the hustle and bustle. God showed me that many teachers there continued teaching biblical values even when there was pressure to stop. And because of this faithfulness, these schools would become havens of protection. Families would arrive guided by a direction they couldn't even explain. Some would spend nights on the road until they found the right building. Others would arrive on foot, coming from farms or nearby neighborhoods. But all would arrive with the same feeling, to protect their children before things got out of control. Inside those schools, there was peace. Not an unreal peace, but that practical feeling of a safe environment. I saw classrooms with makeshift mattresses, teachers organizing snacks, mothers sorting clothes, fathers cleaning the yard. And again, God drew my attention to the elderly. Many grandparents would be responsible for taking their grandchildren to these places because the parents would be working or trying to solve problems that would arise with the financial collapse. God showed me that the elderly would be fundamental pieces at this moment, even tired, even with fragile health. They would become spiritual guides within these schools, keeping the faith firm when the rest of the world is crumbling. Something that struck me was how the children were treated in those places. There was no fear, no inner crisis. They played in the yard, learned, laughed. The feeling God conveyed to me was that the schools would be like small points of light, while the cities were collapsing. Outside, people were chasing after money that no longer existed. The digital system was frozen. Transportation was at a standstill. Bills were frozen. Inside, children were protected, receiving simple instruction, hot food, and words of hope. And the elderly, even tired, were like pillars. There was always one sitting on a bench in the hallway, observing, watching over, praying softly. God made it clear that these schools would be specific havens for families with children. The other shelters were important, but these were geared towards the new generation. He made me understand that even amidst the chaos, He would not allow children to be thrown into despair. Many of them would grow up in these simple environments, learning to trust in God from an early age and not to depend entirely on the digital world, which will eventually collapse. At that moment, I began to see how everything fit together: mountains for intercession, caves for preservation, sheds for shelter, schools for the protection of childhood. When that vision ended, I stood there, absorbing everything. I thought a lot about the elderly, because God kept showing me how much more they would suffer from the collapse of the systems. But He also showed me how He would honor them. Many would be guided to these places before the younger ones. Many would be protection for their grandchildren. Many would be pillars of faith amidst the collapse. And God was making it very clear that no one would be left without direction if they were willing to listen. The feeling that remained with me was simple. He is not warning to scare us. He is warning us to prepare us. And everything points to the same period, the last days of December. After seeing the 4 refugees, the vision changed again, but this time it didn't show me any specific place. It was as if God was giving me an overview of what will happen in the world in the days between December 25th and 30th. And, contrary to what many people imagine, it wasn't an image filled with visual chaos. It was more like understanding something from the inside, clearly, without confusion. I first perceived the financial collapse. What God was showing me was simple. What today depends on digital systems will stop working. not due to a common technical failure, but due to a general collapse affecting banks, apps, cards, and everything that depends on the internet. Nobody will be able to access their account, pay bills, withdraw money, or resolve anything. This outage will generate what is already expected: panic, especially in large cities where everything depends on speed and convenience. I saw people trying to solve things on their cell phones, refreshing the screen 1,000 times, without understanding why nothing was working. I saw huge lines at closed banks. I saw businesses refusing cards because they simply had no system. And I saw elderly people completely lost, holding their cell phones without knowing what to do, because everything they know today, retirement, medicine, transportation, digital accounts, depends on electronic access. God made me understand that. They will be the ones who suffer the most from this initial impact. After the financial chaos begins, the vision showed a second phase, which would arrive soon after: religious persecution. It didn't appear dramatically, but as a logical sequence. When systems enter crisis, governments begin to try to control people. And when that happens, it always falls on those who pray, those who read the Bible, those who refuse to live without faith. I saw laws emerging quickly, restricting religious gatherings. I saw churches being forced to follow orders that completely contradict the word. I saw people being questioned simply for carrying a Bible in their bag. It wasn't an exaggeration. It was a consequence of a world collapsing. I also saw increased control over technology, not as something evil, but as a desperate attempt to stabilize the country. The problem is that this control affects everything: cell phones, computers, the internet, cameras. Any device is monitored without warning, and in this, Christians end up being targeted, not because they are enemies, but because they continue to meet even when the authorities prohibit it. I saw people being digitally blocked, losing access to what remained, having their location tracked. And once again, those who became most vulnerable were the elderly, because many don't even understand about privacy, tracking, or security updates. But God also showed me a very clear contrast. The four refugees continued to function. I saw the mountains, full of peace. I saw the caves, full of provision. I saw the sheds receiving entire families. I saw the schools protecting children without them realizing the gravity of the situation outside. While the world was collapsing, these places remained firm because God had prepared everything in advance. And this brought me certainty. No one needs to despair if they pay attention to what He is warning now. The last thing God placed in me in this chapter of the vision was simple and powerful. Not everyone will be able to reach the shelters, not because there's a lack of space, but because many people don't want to listen. I saw people trapped in comfort, insisting on trying to solve everything on their own, even when everything is blocked. I saw elderly people wanting to trust the system that has always worked, without realizing that it will be precisely this system that will fail first. And I also saw many humble people being guided with ease, as if God were pulling them by the hand. In the midst of all this, the message was clear. Whoever is willing to listen to His direction will find a way out. Whoever is trapped by what the world offers will feel lost. And that's what stayed with me when this part ended. When that part of the vision passed, what came next was harder to understand. It wasn't a scene, it wasn't an image, it was an awareness that God placed within me, as if He were saying, "Pay attention to this." What I felt was that not everyone will be able to reach the refuges, even knowing about them, and that deeply affected me, because it had nothing to do with merit. It was about willingness. God showed me that many people will try to maintain life as it is, even when everything starts to grind to a halt between December 25th and 30th. People who believe that everything will return to normal quickly. People who depend too much on the system. People who are afraid of change. And that's precisely what will prevent many people from seeing the path. The vision made it very clear that the elderly will be the most affected by this difficulty, not because of a lack of faith, but because of the shock. Today, everything in their lives is digital: retirement, transportation, medicine, bills, apps. When that collapses, many will be lost, thinking they just have to wait for the system to come back online. And God made me feel that this waiting is what will put many of them at risk, because while they try to recover normalcy, they won't perceive the direction He is giving them, a direction that doesn't come through the screen, but through the heart. That was the part that saddened me the most because I clearly saw that they would be the first to need help. I also saw people who are comfortable today and can't let go of it. People who trust more in their own stability than in any spiritual guidance. I saw people saying, "This won't last, this will pass, this is just a technical problem," and missing the exact moment when God would be calling. These people will remain stuck between pride and fear, unable to take the step they need. It wasn't arrogance, it was attachment. Attachment to what they know, to what's in their bank account, to what routine offers. And because of this attachment, they won't be able to hear the direction. In contrast, God showed me humble people walking with impressive ease, people who don't have much but who have open hearts. I saw simple elderly people being guided as if God were leading them by the hand. I saw families who had never had stability being the first to find refuge, not because they are better, but because they weren't attached to anything. This part of the vision taught me something profound. Those who have lived depending on God will be able to recognize His voice more quickly when everything falls apart. And I understood that the problem is not the crisis, but the resistance of those who try to control everything alone. Another thing God made clear is that there will be division within families themselves. I saw children who no longer listened to God's direction and who took paths different from their parents. I saw elderly people wanting to follow the guidance of the Spirit and young people insisting on staying in the cities, believing that the government would solve everything. I saw couples separating at this time, not for lack of love, but because one could discern and the other could not. And God showed me that He doesn't force anyone. He calls, He warns, He directs. But each person decides whether or not to obey. This part hurt, because I saw parents crying for their children, and I saw children seeking parents who didn't want to listen. At the end of this chapter of the vision, the feeling that remained with me was clear and direct. God doesn't abandon anyone, but not everyone wants to be guided. It's not about merit, nor about being more spiritual. It's about being willing. He will speak, He will guide, He will warn. But those who are trapped in comfort, control, fear, or attachment to the system will have difficulty seeing the safe path. Meanwhile, the humble, especially many elderly people, will be the first to receive guidance because they are the ones who truly seek God the most. When that part ended, I knew that the final part was still missing. The reason why all this is being shown now. As the vision began to fade, there was no noise, no unusual light, nothing impressive. A clarity washed over me, as if God were closing a matter He needed me to understand. What remained in my heart was that He wasn't showing tragedy to frighten me. He was showing a way out. And everything pointed to the same period. Between December 25th and 30th, He wanted me to understand that there is time, but there is never enough. And that warning people, especially the elderly who will suffer the most from the system outages, is urgent and necessary. I kept thinking about what it would be like to tell all this to other people, not because I'm ashamed, but because it's a serious matter and many people don't believe it when they don't see anything happening yet. But God placed within me a firmness that didn't match my natural way. It was as if He were saying, "Speak. Whoever wants to listen will understand." And I knew that this included people who have already been through a lot in this life. Elderly people who struggled, raised children, worked hard, and now depend on medication, benefits, digital systems. Precisely what will fail first when December arrives. The most powerful part for me was realizing that God isn't revealing this to favor anyone. He's calling everyone closer. He's saying that whoever seeks guidance now, whoever starts praying truly, whoever lets go of their attachment to comfort and routine, will know where to go when the time comes. And this applies to all ages, but especially to those who are most vulnerable, the elderly. I clearly saw that God has a special affection for this age group at this moment. He wants to protect them, guide them, and prevent them from suffering more than necessary. Another thing that became very clear is that God doesn't want anyone lost. He doesn't want anyone running around frantically when things get tough. He wants people to recognize His voice beforehand, so they won't be confused later. I saw that in the refuges, there will be direction, peace, and stability. God prepared this in advance. It's not improvisation, it's not invention, it's care. The mountains, the caves, the sheds, and the schools form a spiritual map that He is drawing for those who are willing to follow, and He wants this map to reach the elderly especially, because they will be the ones who need the most help. When the vision ended, I sat for a few minutes trying to absorb everything. It wasn't a feeling of superiority nor fear, it was responsibility. I knew that what God had shown me wasn't just for me, it was for people He loves. It was for those who are tired, for those who are lost, for those who live alone, for those who are afraid to depend on digital systems, for those who have already seen so much in life and don't want to suffer anymore. I understood that God was giving a warning because He always warns beforehand. Always. He never leaves His people without direction. In the end, what remained with me was simple and straightforward. Seek God now, not out of desperation, but out of preparation. Don't wait for the system to collapse before trying to hear His voice. He is speaking beforehand. He is guiding now. And He is showing real, practical, and spiritual ways to protect His people, especially the elderly, whom the world often ignores, but God never ignores. He is saying, I will take care of you. And that's why I'm sharing all this, so that no one is caught unprepared, and so that everyone knows that God is already ahead of everything that will happen. Lord my God, I place before you every person who is listening to or reading this testimony. I ask that the Lord give clarity, peace, and direction. May their hearts not be dominated by fear, but by an understanding of your care. Take special care of the elderly, sir. It strengthens their body, mind, and spirit. It protects everyone who depends on medicines, benefits, transportation, and digital systems. Guide them to safe places, whether on the street, at home, or in the refuges that the Lord prepares. Speak to each person in a simple and direct way. Show the way. Show me what to do. Show me where to go. May none of your children be lost in the midst of chaos. Let no one be left alone. May none be left without your voice. It touches families, restores relationships, brings unity and faith. May your Holy Spirit be the comfort, strength, and light in every decision. We trust that the Lord is in charge. Before any fall, before any persecution, before any change, the Lord has already prepared everything. And we thank you because you are a God of care, protection, and deliverance. In the name of Jesus, amen.